would talk about Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, people would get their backs up a little bit. Ah, it must mean you're rejecting science. I don't know why there was that leap of logic, but it wasn't that at all. I'm just saying there's other kind of knowledge that matters. And the fact is, Indigenous peoples, organizations, and communities also want science because they want to make the best decisions they can.
Welcome to this special episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. In this episode, you'll hear a lot of wisdom shared by Dr. Deborah McGregor about Indigenous Knowledge Systems, and these concepts are foundational to having successful co-management relationships where in Western science alone can't fix all of the major challenges that we face. So I first met Deborah on Galliano Island in British Columbia. We were both invited to a creative writing retreat hosted by Dr. Kate Sandilands. And we were being asked to write a lot differently and less academically. I can only assume that for Deborah, it was much less of a leap. I certainly didn't find it natural, to say the least. But it has been an honor to stay in touch with her, and we've recently been on some of the same panels together and invited to some similar speaking spaces. And this podcast is adapted from a guest talk she did in one of my co-management classes. So you'll find she's very humble and shares all of her knowledge in such a diplomatic way. But I wanted to highlight some of her accomplishments so we can celebrate her before this talk and podcast is shared. So Dr. McGregor is an Anishinaabe scholar, an internationally celebrated scholar, and an Indigenous Knowledge Systems expert, known for her work in applying Indigenous knowledges to address environmental issues. She is a professor and held a Canada Research Chair on Indigenous Environmental Justice at Osgoode Hall School and the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change at York University. Most recently, Dr. McGregor was appointed to the University of Calgary as a Canada Excellence Research Chair in Indigenous Ways of Climate and Water Sustainability for Planetary Health and Well-Being. This appointment marks a significant achievement for Dr. McGregor, recognizing her expertise in Indigenous environmental justice and her dedication to addressing pressing environmental issues through Indigenous knowledge systems. Her advancing research program will include the creation of unique co-developed and co-generated knowledge aimed at identifying solutions that promote planetary well-being and justice for people and for all life. So as our talk begins, there will be no further interruption from me. Enjoy what is said, and I look forward to your reflections on all of its applicability to managing fish and wildlife with Indigenous peoples in Canada.
I do have a presentation to give you a sense of where I think traditional knowledge is kind of going and where it's been. What I will say is to introduce this a little bit more, or the perspective that I'm trying to bring to this particular conversation is I worked for Environment Canada, and I was head of Indigenous at the time Aboriginal Affairs, but and working on traditional knowledge in a science-based department and trying to help scientists wrap their heads around what that meant in terms of the work that they do is one of the areas that I worked on. And yeah, so I'm aware somewhat of what some of the challenges are, because I mean the vocabulary's changed over time. Traditional knowledge, tech, Aboriginal knowledge for a period of time now, Indigenous knowledge has been in environmental legislation for some time, actually 20 plus years, 25 years almost, I think, for maybe SEPA, impact assessment, and more recently now in the Fisheries Act and others. So that's I wanted to talk a little bit about, like, why, what are some of the challenges that people might, or that I found that people might confront, and sometimes I think understanding where Indigenous peoples are coming from was helpful in terms of traditional knowledge. So we'll see how this goes. And then there's a graphic to show sort of how I see it kind of playing out and why I think sometimes these conversations can go sideways because we're using certain vocabulary, but we're not actually meaning the same thing sometimes. So we'll do that. And thinking about how do you do Indigenous knowledge research is what does that kind of look like? So I always start off with this because I think it's one of the most important things that I have to remind people of, and I don't just mean you, but just period, is that Indigenous peoples were here for thousands of years. And like I'm Anishinaabe in the Great Lakes. So I'm in Toronto at the moment. So I work and live kind of my own territory in the Great Lakes. So people would have been here for thousands of years and were complete societies. This is going to matter later on, why it's important to talk about that. So one where I am right now in the Great Lakes, there's knowledge that has been here for thousands of years, often not part of any kind of decision making, but it's important to understand Indigenous peoples as not like populations or just stakeholders or interest groups, but actually societies that have laws and governance and knowledge systems and protocols for how you share knowledge. So that already exists in communities and has for a really long time. So part of our context is Indigenous knowledge has been important since time immemorial. And so the field itself is relatively recent when the terminology has changed over time. And it didn't come from an Indigenous place, which I found out the hard way in doing a research project on tech. And elders didn't know what I was talking about. And, it came from the sort of international realm. But the idea of Indigenous knowledge, of course, because 1,000 years ago from my ancestors, no one would have been saying traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. It was just the way it was, and it was just our knowledge, right? So that's more of a recent thing, but it's always been important in order for the Indigenous societies to function and to do the work that they needed to do and meet the goals and vision of their community. So as I mentioned before, the point here is that people had their own systems for how they were generating knowledge, how they were governing knowledge, for what counted as knowledge. That already exists. And then we're trying to package it in some way so it could be consumed or applied in other sort of contexts other than the Indigenous one that existed for thousands of years. So often that's not understood that a lot of these processes already exist in Indigenous communities. So this is just like the broader context. So when the concept started to emerge, the Brundtland Report, the Rio Conference, people started to talk about Indigenous knowledge. The point here that I actually wanted to make that I often talk about here is that the narrative started to switch around Indigenous peoples from that of being some kind of problem to be solved, the really poor, really marginalized, really vulnerable, and still are. I'm not saying that isn't an important kind of story or narrative to have, but also that there was this knowledge that was there that could also help address these big problems that were being discussed in a lot of these international and global meetings. So then there was all this interest. Indigenous knowledge was already there in communities, and then all of a sudden there's this interest in it. What is this knowledge? Like, what is it about this knowledge that's going to help us address a lot of these challenges? And in Canada, it starts to show up in legislation, policy, how people do research and practices in that. But there's still, a lot of resistance to it. And I think really when I think about, I got my PhD in forestry, nobody was learning this. No one was training scientists about anything to do with Indigenous people, let alone Indigenous knowledge. So there is a broader context that you're finding yourself in the work that you're doing. So now I'm kind of delving into the research part of it. So the narrative around how research is done with Indigenous peoples has changed quite dramatically over the last, I would say, 3 decades, probably really within the last decade, around data sovereignty, knowledge production. There's actually a conference at Chiefs of Ontario next week all on this topic. But the point I wanted to make here that's really relevant to the field of Indigenous knowledge is how you might be in a position as a scientist or a manager of trying to validate or evaluate traditional knowledge in whatever process it is people are involved in. And what the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples said was you would be using the standards used by Aboriginal peoples to legitimize and validate knowledge. And most people don't know how to do that. So that becomes a limitation. Of course, Indigenous peoples had their ways of doing that. So that's an important thing to understand as well, is understanding sort of the limits of what you know, that will enable you to do that. So of course that means who can do that then? And then I would say, well, you need to involve Indigenous peoples in that process to do that because they already know how to do that. Most of the research conducted outside of Indigenous communities, this is something I always tell my students again, is most of what we know in terms of the existing body of knowledge has to be open to reassessment because it wasn't validated by Indigenous communities. A lot of times it wasn't run by Indigenous communities because the first thing we do in this work is, what does the existing literature say? What does it say? I find in the work I've been doing around climate sciences, if people weren't asking the right questions decades ago, we haven't generated that body of knowledge yet. So now a lot of folks are interested in how can we link knowledge? How can we, how do we weave knowledge together? But if we weren't like doing that work or asking those questions decades ago, I find, or even 10 years ago, then we actually don't have that body of work a lot of the times to draw on. And what is there, you have to really kind of think critically about it as well. How was it done? Was it validated by Indigenous peoples? What did that look like? So that becomes important as well. So I'm not going to say too much about this because there's just so much work being done on this across the country. But what I will say is the way that I see traditional knowledge or tech knowledge or Indigenous knowledge, a lot of that research being done is very extractive on Indigenous communities. It's still like that. I think a lot of universities and I think governments are becoming a lot better about not doing that through, finally now we've got like the Indigenous Knowledge Policy Framework. So that's trying to move away from that kind of extractive type of way of doing things. But I find, especially when I was at Environment Canada and I'd be reviewing traditional knowledge studies as part of environmental assessments or whatever, was they weren't produced by the communities. They were being produced by proponents or other people. So they're not being generated from the community itself. They were more like where the knowledge was being extracted from. So fortunately, that's starting to change as Indigenous folks and organizations are starting to develop their own protocols around research. Or the research protocols can also be traditional knowledge protocols, and the traditional knowledge protocols can actually be Indigenous knowledge protocols as well. Those are very helpful, I would say, for folks who work in, actually for anybody who's interested in working with communities, because they're already providing you the guidance that you need to know in order to work with them. You don't need to try to figure it out. It's already kind of laid out. There just isn't enough of them as we'd like to see, because it's a fair degree of capacity to develop them and then to administer them. So again, the Indigenous context, in terms of how we understand our knowledge systems, there's always an ethic of responsibility that comes with it. I just don't learn things for the heck of it. I'm expected to do something useful with that knowledge. It's kind of an expectation that a lot of Indigenous folks would have with people who are interested in their knowledge. So there's a different way that we actually even think about knowledge itself. Like our whole worldview on knowledge, how it gets revealed to you and how you access it. Are you ready for it? So sometimes that assessment's being done by Indigenous folks when they're deciding what they're going to share with you or not share with you. They're like, are you actually ready to hear this? Are you gonna work with this knowledge in a good way? It's in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I like this particular article. I think it's Article 31, 32 that deals specifically with Indigenous knowledge, or under it they say traditional knowledge. But here I just wanted to emphasize again these responsibilities that come with knowledge. It's not just for the sake of it, that when knowledge is shared with you, there's this understanding, there's an obligation, a responsibility to take care of that knowledge and use it in a beneficial way. Sources and the nature of traditional knowledge. My favorite quote by Winona Duke: there's no way to quantify a way of life, only way to live it. So it's very hard to quantify different aspects of Indigenous way of living, as like for environmental assessment, you're trying to predict impacts or hard to do that. Yet we find ourselves trying to do that in different ways. Important to also acknowledge the source of knowledge. Again, Indigenous folks have their own folks who we would consider to be experts in what a source of knowledge would be. And again, we have our own protocols, understanding knowledge as a gift, and it's also a verb. It's not, again, Anishinaabe language specifically, because I can't speak for other languages, is very verb-based. Everything's about doing something. What's being verbed, who's verbing, and it's the same thing with knowledge. What are you going to do with this? What does it look like when you verb action it? Indigenous knowledge systems. The main point I wanted to make here is that Indigenous knowledge exists within systems of knowledge. So this goes back to my first slide where I talked about Indigenous peoples were complete societies for thousands of years. So I work at York University. Certain people are considered to be knowledge holders and experts, generally people with a PhD. A lot of programming is regulated provincially, what programs, the kind of review, the external reviews that they go through, curriculum, what we're teaching people, that's all part of a big knowledge system, starting from K to 12 in terms of how we prep students either for work or how we prep them to go on to post-secondary school or to the trades. It's all part of this system, and it's all also very political. Yeah, Ontario's Indigenous studies curriculum changed quite dramatically under the current government. So Indigenous peoples are also part of systems. And so we had who we considered to be experts and why we were generating knowledge and what kind of challenges it was designed to meet. So my point here is that just thinking about Indigenous knowledge as just Indigenous knowledge is not, it's very limiting in terms of fully understanding what it is. It's part of a knowledge system. So understanding the source of where it came from, it could come from a spiritual source. It could come from the natural world. It could be revealed to people. So the source of it is different. In my job, I spend a lot of time reading things and writing and talking about what I've read or what's been written, generally not talking about other sources of knowledge, although sometimes experience, I think I do quite a bit of. So knowledge is like generated and produced in very particular ways for very particular purposes within this knowledge system, within this society. And it is a lot of the times it's embedded how people live. So for example, the first time I started to work with this concept around knowledge when I was actually in graduate school, and we went into communities that tell us about traditional knowledge, and one, they didn't know what we were talking about. They're just like, we don't even know what you mean by that. We can't translate that. And then you're asking people questions around kind of how they live their life. That sometimes that's kind of hard. It's like me asking everyone, how do you breathe? Like, how do you drink your coffee? You probably could describe that, but it's just like how people kind of do things. And then you're asking questions that's trying to package it in a particular way. So it's not just data, which is often how people think about Indigenous knowledge. It's actually part of this broader system, just like you're part of a broader system. And I was when I worked in federal government. I just wanted to show this to you. This is Nicole Latalupi. This particular piece was published. She was my PhD student, and this was part of her comp. What she did was she looked across the Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, tech literature, and she developed a typology about how people work with it, how she found people work with it. I think this was published maybe in Alternative. And so she called it, what is the relationship between Western and Indigenous knowledge? How can tech improve resource management? So she divided it. She found in looking at it, the typology she developed was people are interested in the ecological knowledge. There's the people engage with it critically, like they'll use Indigenous people and knowledge to critique things. We see that as a bit of a problem, but often our knowledge is used for that. Relational, how can knowledge be shared to be of mutual benefit? And then collaborative, and then how it starts showing up in resource management. So knowledge isn't just gathered or documented or from the Indigenous point of view shared with others just for the sake of it. It's like for very specific purposes and kind of fits into, I guess you could say, different categories how people want to work with it. So I just wanted to kind of show you this, that it's not just like a blob of knowledge that people are trying to collect and then trying to figure out, how do I use this in my restoration program for turtle? That's my CWS sort of bias here. But it's actually could be for management, could be for different purposes. So she elaborates a lot more on that in this paper. It's one of the only ones where I've seen there's a specific typology about how people, it's probably changed a little bit since. I like to probably see how it's used in governance and law. That wasn't her question at the time, but that would be probably another category that I would add upon a review of the literature. So strangely enough, so these are just sort of like different ways that people were trying to wrap their heads around Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge. See, like Nicole Natalupi's typology. And now we have, so people would typically look at, you'd start off by doing a literature review. I remember helping some folks try to design a caribou research study, traditional knowledge study. So you're looking at the literature. And again, I already said that's open for assessment because it wasn't done by the community, may not have been done in collaboration. They weren't able to validate the findings. You do kind of like but you do a literature review, develop the survey or whatever, or the interview instrument to do the primary research and data collection. And so their model sort of went, how do you go from the bare minimum of trying to do traditional knowledge in the work that you do to self-management? I guess you could also say co-management. Self-management was, we were trying to move to a place where was trying to recognize, I guess now we would call it co-governance, where Indigenous peoples are part of that decision making. So let's say we're trying to recover a turtle species in a particular community, rather than just people coming in, doing this research, and then imposing whatever the Species at Risk Act says around the recovery of the species. You'd be working with the community, utilizing science and traditional knowledge, making those decisions together about the best way to recover that particular species, as opposed to just, let's say, relying on the literature. In my view, a lot of people, they don't have great traditional knowledge surveys, in my experience. They don't know how to ask those questions because you're asking this way of life and you're trying to like get at a specific component of it. It's really hard to do that. Having conversations with people, deliberating is to me a lot better way of doing it. It's harder because you got to know when specific knowledge is actually being shared with you. You have to be highly skilled to be able to do that. So this was a system where we were trying to figure out what it is that people do in relation to traditional knowledge. This is probably 10 plus years old. And like I said, it probably started going into co-governance. So I also started to try to outline what some of the key community considerations would be. Like, what is it that concerns communities about traditional knowledge? Because they have to decide whether they want to share this. There is no traditional knowledge work, in my view, unless you're actually engaging with people, because they're the ones who have it. Unless you're just totally, again, relying on literature review. But again, that's not traditional knowledge study. It's open to reassessment. Who did that work? There's a lot of critical analysis that would have to go into if you were just going to rely on that. So communities have to think about, how will this benefit? How will doing this work benefit us? Because our knowledge was intended to help us solve whatever problems of the day was, and also for future generations to be able to use it to pass on to them. If we're sharing it for the purpose, other people's purposes, or so they can fulfill their mandate, how's that going to benefit us as well? How will it be used internally, externally, and by who? So they think about, well, if we participate in this traditional knowledge work, can we use it in our schools? Can we use it in other ways in our community? Transparency is really big. I know in the Indigenous policy, traditional knowledge policy framework, that this was a big issue. A lot of the times First Nations or Indigenous folks did share traditional knowledge and they have no idea what happened to it. Where did it go? What kind of decision was made? There's just a lack of transparency. Capacity in the community to govern traditional knowledge. So these are just some of the considerations that communities come up with. So one of the challenges you'll find, even with the Indigenous Knowledge Policy Framework, of which they're supposed to be developing further guidance for the folks who work within them, like that's DFO and Environment Canada and others, is how do you protect this knowledge? Very hard to do because of ATEP or whatever they're calling it now. People can access knowledge, so hard to protect. And then for a community perspective, what are we actually protecting? Are we just protecting data or information? Are we protecting our traditional knowledge holders? Are we protecting a way of life? So it's a lot bigger question from an Indigenous perspective in terms of what is it that we're trying to protect when we're, because it's this weird tension where you're trying to share, but you're also trying to protect at the same time. So this is the position that communities find themselves in. So what I just call third-party consideration, recognize it exists within systems of knowledge. And what you're asking people to do is almost unnatural, like you're taking it out and you're putting it in something else. It resides in the people. Indigenous peoples have their own modes of inquiry in terms of how we were generating knowledge. It should support community capacity and decision-making. And I always say this to folks too, working in a science-based department and having done my PhD in a science-based faculty, was as soon as I would talk about Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, people would get their backs up a little bit. Oh, it must mean you're rejecting science. I don't know why there was that leap of logic, but it wasn't that at all. I'm just saying there's other kind of knowledge that matters. And the fact is, Indigenous peoples, organizations, and communities also want science because they want to make the best decisions they can as well. A lot of the time, science isn't shared in ways that people can actually use. But again, if you look at Indigenous communities, societies as decision makers and trying to take care of their communities and governing, that makes perfect sense. Of course, they're going to want the best knowledge that they can get in order to make the best decision. So they work with science all the time. So again, tensions from more Indigenous positions. So what Indigenous communities, the position that they're in when I'm working with them on this is, what are the risks? What are the risks if we share this? Again, because you're trying to share at the same time you're trying to protect. And then what you're trying to protect could be like you're trying to protect your tech holders and way of life in sharing this. So the stakes are usually a lot higher for Indigenous communities in engaging in this work. So there's a lot of, I guess you could say, risk assessment. No one really says, hey, we're doing risk assessment, but this is what people are thinking about. If we share this, what will happen? Our spiritual knowledge or knowledge where you can only find this particular species of whatever, doesn't mean all of a sudden everyone's going to go rushing over there to pick this plant or get this fish or whatever. So there's always this risk management kind of approach to it. Some ethical considerations. So recently I was part of developing a impact assessment toolkit for First Nations in Ontario, and I was responsible for the Indigenous knowledge portion of it. And so I did another review. I used to teach a course on this, so I'm constantly looking for what's the current thing going on in the field. And recently what I was seeing in different protocols this is where the trauma-informed research part comes in, was that some of the questions that people might ask, could be triggering for the knowledge holders. They could be older, they could be residential school survivors. So it's thinking about this too as is not really that well developed, but I found they were kind of further ahead in terms of the specific protocols that they had for trauma-informed research. And that could mean there's somebody there with the person as they're talking, or they need to take breaks, or you need to come back later. For you, that would have budget implications. You need to get approval that you're also providing, I don't know, whatever the protocol looks like for the First Nation, whether that's some kind of compensation or gifts or whatever for the knowledge holder that's sharing the knowledge, but also for the person that's with them. So they're starting to develop and implement these processes that would be required of others, that the research could be, or the nature of the questions, particularly for, I'll just say, species at risk, species that are declining, or someone's impact on way of life could be triggering for people. So you need to think about those kind of things in terms of this work. And I found some of that, but actually on the East Coast too, is where some of the Mi'kmaq protocols were very aware of that particular issue, and they would build it into their very specific procedures for doing some of this work. That's all I'll say about that at this point. OCAP principles. So that concludes, I guess, my view on trying to give you a snapshot of the field as I see it based on my experience in working in Environment Canada, working specifically with First Nations, working in the academic world, trying to help out on a lot of these questions from different perspectives. Okay, this is sort of the last part of it. Applied concepts of traditional knowledge. So this is a framework that was actually developed in the late 80s, early 90s by the Assembly of First Nations when people became really interested in this. They didn't know they were trying to respond to this international interest in Indigenous knowledge. I just developed it a little bit further and then put it into a circle, because before it was sort of like more of a hierarchy. So what most people are interested in, a lot of the traditional knowledge studies that I reviewed as part of my job in Environment Canada, or even trying to help people now in some of the conservation work that I'm involved in, is they tend to focus on data, information, and facts. So they're really interested in that quadrant of knowledge. So for example, someone might be interested in, all right, where's the beaver lodges? Where do they eat? Or again, where does this species spawn? Where are these plants found? So very specific kind of data, kind of information. That's the easiest thing for people to deal with in the Indigenous knowledge field. The other area that that started to ask questions around was the practices and management. So Practices and management is, how do you manage the fish population? How do you manage how can you tell what the population is, whether it's going up or down, or how it's fluctuating? So it starts to get into another level of Indigenous people didn't just use the land, you're actually managing. You're actually doing more with the data and knowledge than just, because that's a common perception. People just use the land, but actually people actually were managing and had practices. So then you get that level, and sometimes people are interested in that. I think especially where First Nations or Indigenous folks are going to maintain control. What is those practices? What does that management look like for sustainability? The other area that, because people start to get a little bit nervous about and don't really know what to do with, is the ethics and beliefs. So a lot of my research on water governance, First Nations water security for both quantity and quality, is the ethic of treating the water like a relative, the ethic of recognizing the water as having a relationship outside of people, the water's relationship directly with the moon. So there's all these beliefs that come in relation to what our relationship to water looks like. And we have our own concepts of what water looks like. There's water that's inside of us, there's women's water, birth water. Like we have our own concepts of what water is. That starts to make people more uncomfortable. They don't know what to do with that. Often what I see happen in reports is it's a little box somewhere with some bullets saying, they believe this about water, as opposed to, so scientists and managers have a hard time dealing with that. Of course, First Nations in their own water governance know how to deal with that and had for thousands of years. People start to get a little bit nervous about that. They're not quite sure what to do with that. How does that fit into management? How does that fit into governance? The other area that people that makes them very uncomfortable is starting to get into the worldview, philosophy around whatever it is that we're talking about. So again, the example in my own work in relation to water is understood to be alive. That's really hard for resource managers to grapple with. Even in my own work right now, we're developing a First Nation led community-based source water protection planning regime, which is a very technical, looks at water in a very particular way as property, commodity, as a resource, but that's not the way a lot of First Nation communities understand their relationship to water. So we're having to figure out how we account for this, not as a little box with a few bullets in it saying Anishinaabe consider water to be alive, but how do we actually incorporate that into the management and governance and planning process that we're trying to create in this. So what tends to happen in the field is people focus on the data, information, and facts. And when you do that, you're removing that kind of information away from the whole body of knowledge, which operates within a system. So that's what makes it extractive. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily serve anybody. First Nations people or Indigenous people get upset because they don't think that their knowledge was used, but data was used, because they look at their knowledge more holistically. And what I will say here is, it is possible to work with communities and they could agree that it is only data and information that they're going to share, because that's how they're going to protect the rest of it. So having said all that, this is more like the nature of the knowledge and what tends to happen and why it's regarded as often extractive. But people can make an agreement. They could decide that's all we want to share. We're not prepared to share the rest of it for whatever reason, right? So that's also possible and does happen in Canada as well. So to me, this framework sort of explains why people have a hard time often dealing with knowledge, and why we're coming from a different place where First Nations and Indigenous people say, we shared our knowledge and didn't even use it. Whereas program managers or biologists or whoever says, but we did, but they were using data and information because they know how to work with that. They could put that in models, but it's hard to put a worldview in a model, or the ethic in a model. Practices in management a little bit better. That can be captured, for lack of a better word, in these processes as well. So I'll maybe just show you this last graphic. So this one, again, is how do we then work with knowledge? And really what it comes down to is, if you want to work with Indigenous knowledge, you got to work with Indigenous people. That's what you have to do. So this model was trying to get at that you have Western systems of knowledge and you have Indigenous systems of knowledge. You're not trying to change them, but you're wanting to bring people together to negotiate and dialogue on how you want to work with each other and what knowledge you're going to bring to whatever challenge or problem that you're trying to address, like why you're getting together in the first place. So that's really what that was just trying to depict, that it's not about extracting knowledge from Indigenous people and sticking it in another framework and hoping for the best. It's actually, you need to have conversations with people. So probably if there's a message to come out of this, in my view, in my experience, if you want to work with Indigenous knowledge, you got to work with Indigenous people. That's the most ethical and appropriate way, in my view, to access and to learn how to, employ this knowledge in an appropriate way. I'll stop there. And I'm sorry, I talked way too much. You can tell I really like this topic. I'm really hoping this was helpful to you, because I am trying to jam 40 years of experience into 40 minutes, and maybe 30 years, not 40.
Do you have time, Deborah, for maybe one or two questions before you have to take off?
I do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, hi, Deborah. Thanks so much. I guess I had a question originally that was kind of like I've heard a lot of people talk more about Indigenous science lately, and folks from nations saying, "Oh, I want to refer to it as science so that it makes it like equal with Western science." And I guess I wondered if you had any reflections on that. And then listening to what you said, I almost thought, "Oh, maybe we should be calling Western science, as you put it, Western knowledge, so that we are acknowledging that it's also part of a system." But anyway, I just wondered if you had reflections.
Environment Canada is really super interested in that because it's part of the climate science plan, but they don't know what it is. And what I do say about it is, it's the way we think about science and the way that we learn about it. Of course, Indigenous peoples would have had that, like systematic ways of trying to understand something. Of course, we could count. So it's just that what was embedded within it was the moral and ethical part of it. So even part of that management and practices and ethics, like that moral and ethical part of it was in there. You weren't trying to separate yourself from that to try to be as objective as possible. It mattered. And for that, I rely a lot on Vine Deloria's work or Greg Ekehete's work. But yeah, Indigenous science. And I think to some extent you're trying to compartmentalize again, but in my view, there is a science. The way that I agree, I like the way Greg Ekehete talks about it is too. He wrote a lot on Indigenous science, and is that just another way of telling a story about the earth. That's what we're trying to understand, right? What models and data collection, and we're trying to understand what's going on, and we're trying to theorize around it and explain meaning. It's a type of storytelling. So Indigenous peoples have stories. Like we don't have time, but one thing I do at my class, let's say the Anishinaabe recreation story, is you could draw out science from that story, biology and ecology in that story. Like it's embedded within that if you know how to read it. We just met a couple of weeks ago at Environment Canada. I wanted to know Indigenous science. I said I could read a study because they want science for assessment, not for adaptation or mitigation, because there's all these silos. And I just said I could read a study and I could tell you what the environmental impacts are but it's a skill to be able to pull that out of there, and you have to know what you're looking for. Yeah, I should stop there because it's like getting into a whole other conversation, but it's an important one and it's an emerging one. So I think that should definitely be something that gets talked about a lot more, because it's really becoming a thing and they're distinguishing it from knowledge, even though it's part of that knowledge system. Because of course, a society that's been around for thousands of years would have science. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
Carrie?
Thanks so much, Deborah. This is really insightful. Appreciate your taking the time here. I had a question early in your presentation. You talked about this transformation from the kind of historical way where we thought about fixing this Indigenous problem towards perhaps a better approach where we understand reconciliation as essential for our well-being and the Earth's well-being. And I see that currently I feel like we're stuck in a state where we're just trying to where it's still extractive, and we're extracting Indigenous knowledge and repackaging it for our needs, for example, under the Fisheries Act. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we can make that transformation so that reconciliation is mainstreamed and it is like in our fisheries management, so that instead of extracting, we're looking at those different cosmologies, we're understanding the world through those other ways, like we're looking at that broader perspective. Because I feel like, we're still stuck on that extractive mode.
So I do turn to the truth and reconciliation for this in the principles. I think it's 6, 7, and 8. I work with 8 a lot, which specifically says respect for elders, Indigenous knowledge. So they do have specific recommendations in relation to knowledge in that work. And the way that I interpret it, and this was my input into when they were developing the Indigenous knowledge policy framework, and it wasn't as strong there as I would have liked to have seen, because it was like, we want this knowledge, we want it to be shared. They're assuming a lot of capacity on the part of Indigenous peoples. And I said, you know what you need to do because we need to actually support communities to retain and to revitalize. And that's not there. And it's going to be so hard as a manager or a scientist to convince people to put money into that, right? So let's say a lot of my work as an academic is to work with youth, language retention, revitalization, being on the land. That's big efforts on a part of Indigenous communities to be able to do that. For you to be able to do your work, let's say, if this were the context, let's say 4 decades ago, it would have been very different, because I think about my community, there would have been so many people that you could talk to, let's say, about fisheries. Now there's few. There's not that many, because they've passed on through various reasons. People aren't fishing as much anymore. And so a lot of them, you actually need to revitalize and retain what's already there. That needs to happen. So I think that would be a message that comes from the then it's not as strong in the policy as it should be. Like, how are you going to get this 40 years from now if we don't do this? If we don't do that now, we're not going to, because I can already see the difference in my own lifetime, right? And I think probably many communities would say that. Maybe you could talk to 50 people. Now you can only talk to 6. And 20 years from now, maybe it's only going to be 2, unless effort gets into this process of revitalizing and retaining in communities where that knowledge already exists. So I think that could be a focus. I would have liked to have seen it there, because it's based on a number of assumptions that actually that are not holding. For example, the knowledge isn't increasing in communities, it's actually decreasing, unless you put the effort into counteracting whatever challenges the community is facing. Does that kind of make sense? I know it sounds kind of cynical, but I kept trying to push for that. I was doing work with Atlantic Policy Congress on the framework, like what our input was going to be. And that's what people said. And that's what our input said, but I didn't see it in the final. So I'm like, that's all nice to do that, but community actually needs to be supported to be able to retain this body of work so that you can then use it for your work. But the TRC points to the principles. I would say this is what you need to do. So I refer to those principles quite a bit, especially number 6, 7, and 8, where they talk about language and elders and Indigenous knowledge.
Deb, I'm sure there's many more questions, but Greg will be the last one for now, just out of respect for your time.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you very much for that presentation. I appreciate it very much. I have a question to do with the point that you brought up about how it's important for some First Nations communities to provide some information about beliefs alongside the data, and having that discussion about how much to incorporate into a final product that's being produced. And I'm wondering about the definitions of beliefs and religion and separation of church and state, and how that could get into a bit of a sticky area in which we're kind of reporting or providing a lot of spiritual context within government documents, and how that could get us into some dangerous territory.
I think the first thing that I would say is that religion and spirituality aren't the same. Like, that's comparing apples and oranges. Like, I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't discuss Indigenous spirituality as religion at all. And I'll speak from an Anishinaabe point of view. Spiritual knowledge and laws isn't something we would share externally. So chances are you wouldn't have really access to that anyway. So I think, and I think they would be the ones to provide that kind of guidance. Yeah, it's a good question, but it's apples and oranges. Like, religion and spirituality aren't the same thing. The other thing is spirituality is kind of the English word. No one, like, I don't even know what the translation is for spirituality. Nobody says it. Like, when people are speaking in the language and giving a teaching, nobody uses that word at all. So I think we become really constrained by English. And what I guess on the opposite end of things, what those triggers could be for scientists, oh my God, spirituality. Religion is automatically going to be like the free association there, but nobody actually uses that word when they're speaking about this in the language. It's different conceptually. That's just what we're stuck with English. And I'm not fluent in my own language to be able to tell you. I just know enough from hearing it when people are speaking it, they're not using that. So let's say people are going to talk about election. If they're speaking, they'll say election in English if there's no corresponding concept for that, right? And so, so I think that would be what I would say. They're not the same at all. And often People might talk about what we'll call spirituality, but they're usually not sharing the specifics of that. Like Anishinaabe anyway, that's not generally shared externally. Even internally, it's very specific to who can actually handle that, because there's so much responsibility that comes with it that not everyone can handle that. And so it's very governed, I guess you could say. And that wouldn't be handed off to people they didn't think could handle that kind of knowledge. So I don't know if that's really helpful. That's a bigger conversation, and one that I know is a challenging one. It's probably why it ends up in a little box somewhere.
Well,
That is helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for listening, and hopefully I'll see you again. No doubt in some kind of circle in the future. That's what happens.
For sure. Take care. So that was an extremely applicable talk from Dr. Deborah McGregor. In our work in co-management, it is really important to reflect on her thoughts on vocabulary and what constitutes Indigenous knowledge systems. Also, what are the various dimensions to Indigenous knowledge? It is clear that for people trained in the Western sciences, that it is easiest to focus only on the ecological aspects of that knowledge and miss the holistic insights. People are also at risk of engaging in extractive research practices if they don't align themselves with the needs of Indigenous people. I also thought her parts about cultural continuity were vital. For people that ask what they can do to help, there are some very thought-provoking insights into the risk and threats to Indigenous knowledge systems. Most scientists or government agencies may not see this as their responsibility to engage with and help to revitalize or ensure Indigenous knowledge systems thrive in the future. But if we don't reflect on this part of Deborah's talk more, there is a risk that vast amounts of Indigenous knowledge will be lost to humanity in the future. So thanks once again to Dr. McGregor for this talk and all of her contributions to environmental justice. Hi, I'm Dr. Jamie Snook, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. Honoring the spirit and intent of agreements with Indigenous peoples is an important form of reconciliation and social justice, and educating ourselves about opportunities with co-management is time well spent. This conversation continues, so please like, share, subscribe, and visit www.comanagement.ca. Join me again next time for another interesting discussion about the co-management of fish and wildlife in Canada and around the world.